All right, let's talk tariffs. Those taxes slapped onto goods coming in from other countries.
Yeah, on the surface, they sound simple enough, right? Protect our own industries, maybe even rake in some extra cash for the government.
Exactly. But it's not always that straightforward, is it? There's a potential downside to that whole protectionist approach.
Well, absolutely. It's like a gamble, really. You might see some short-term benefits, but the long-term consequences can be a real kick in the teeth, economically speaking. Plus, you got to factor in the potential for some serious international friction.
Right, those ripple effects. To really get a grip on that, we're diving deep into a couple of historical case studies that are, well, let's just say they're infamous for a reason. The McKinley Tariff of 1890, and then a few decades later, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930.
Those two are pretty much the poster children for how tariffs can go sideways. They weren't just minor adjustments, they were huge swings in policy that ended up triggering some truly dramatic, long-lasting economic consequences.
And for anyone thinking, why are we digging up these old economic skeletons? It's because those debates about trade and tariffs, they never really go away, do they?
Nope, they just keep popping up in different forms. It's like a perennial weed in the garden of global economics.
The question of protectionism versus open markets, it's always simmering. And by understanding what happened back then, we can hopefully gain some insights into how things might play out today when those same ideas come back around.
It's all about using history as a guide, right? So let's rewind back to the late 1800s. Picture this. The U.S. already had pretty high tariffs in place, and the Republican Party, well, they were all about protectionism, especially after the Civil War.
Their thinking was that shielding domestic industries from all that foreign competition, that was the key to keeping America prosperous and strong.
Right, that was the prevailing wisdom. And then along comes Congressman William McKinley, and he really pushes this idea forward.
The tariff that eventually bore his name, the McKinley Tariff of 1890, it had a pretty clear objective.
Yeah, make those imported goods a lot more expensive, so Americans would naturally gravitate towards buying stuff made right here in the good old USA.
And we're not talking about a slight price bump here. We're talking a significant hike. The McKinley Tariff pushed the average import duty to almost 50%. That's a huge jump from the roughly 38% it was before.
That's a pretty clear message to consumers. Buy American is basically written all over it. It's one of the highest peacetime tariff rates the U.S. has ever seen.
So what happened? Did everything go according to plan?
Well, not exactly. It didn't quite unfold the way they hoped. You see, one of the first things that happened was a noticeable uptick in prices for everyday goods that people needed. Think about it. American manufacturers, they suddenly had a lot less competition from overseas.
They had more leverage, so they raised prices.
Precisely. And so almost immediately, you see the average American's purchasing power getting squeezed.
It wasn't just luxury items either. This was hitting basic necessities. And you know what's interesting? Farmers actually got caught in the crossfire, too.
Oh, yeah, they got hit from both sides. They had to shell out more for their equipment and supplies because those were also subject to the tariffs.
And then, to make matters worse, other countries retaliated. Like Canada, they actually strengthened their trade ties with Great Britain instead of moving closer to the U.S.
The much.
We're closer unions through tariffs.
Yeah, it went in the complete opposite direction. The idea was to bolster America's trade position, but it ended up creating more tension. And the public, they weren't too happy about it either.
No, they weren't. And they made their voices heard loud and clear. Just weeks after the McKinley Tariff went into effect, the Republicans suffered some pretty big losses in the 1890 midterm elections.
Yeah, they lost control of the House, and McKinley himself even lost his seat in Congress. That's a pretty big sign that people were unhappy.
It's a huge sign. And that widespread discontent really helped fuel the rise of the Populist Party, which was largely driven by farmers and working-class folks who felt like these high tariffs and other policies were stacking the deck against them and benefiting the wealthy elite. The Democrats seized on this wave of public anger and campaigned hard against the McKinley Tariff. And when they got back into power, they managed to lower some of those rates with the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act in 1894.
But by then, the damage was already done.
The economic fallout was already in motion.
Exactly. And probably the biggest, most lasting consequence of the McKinley Tariff was its role in the economic downturn that started in the early 1890s. By pushing up costs and messing with international trade, it's widely believed to have contributed to a pretty unstable market here at home and a general lack of confidence in the economy.
Right, and then came 1893 and the Panic of 1893.
Oh, yeah, that was a real turning point. It started with a major railroad company going belly up, and that triggered a cascade of bank failures and businesses collapsing left and right.
And remember, the economy was already weakened, partly thanks to those high tariffs and rising prices, so this panic just snowballed into a full-blown depression.
One of the worst the U.S. had ever seen up to that point.
Unemployment went through the roof, reaching something like 18 to 20% in the mid-1890s.
You saw the very real consequences of that economic hardship. Breadlines started forming, and those makeshift homeless encampments popped up, the ones that became known as Coxey's Army. It was a tough time for a lot of people, and it really dragged on for years.
So if we were to sum up the McKinley tariff era, we're looking at sky-high tariffs, leading to increased prices for consumers, international trade disputes, a political earthquake, and a major economic downturn capped off by the Panic of 1893.
It was a wake-up call for a lot of Americans, a harsh lesson about the dangers of going overboard with protectionist policies. They saw firsthand how it could backfire and cause widespread economic pain.
A cautionary tale for sure. Now, fast forward almost 40 years, and what do we see?
Well, we see history sort of repeating itself, unfortunately. It's June 1930, the world's in the grips of the Great Depression, and what does the U.S. do? It enacts the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act.
Which is now widely considered one of the biggest policy blunders of all time, right? Most experts agree that it actually made the Great Depression worse.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. It's a classic example of good intentions gone wrong.
Just like the McKinley tariff, the thinking behind Smoot-Hawley was rooted in that protectionist mindset. Lawmakers wanted to protect American jobs and farmers in the face of this massive economic crisis, especially after the stock market crash of '29.
But this time, the global economic situation was way more dire. And it's important to note that the U.S. already had fairly high tariffs in place from the 1920s, thanks to the Fordney-McCumber tariff. Smoot-Hawley just cranked things up another notch.
A big notch. It raised tariff on thousands of products by an average of about 20%, and that was on top of the rates that were already in place. It made a lot of imported goods basically unaffordable for most Americans.
Yeah, it was a major price hike. And what's really interesting about Smoot-Hawley is that it faced a ton of opposition before it even became law.
Oh, right. Unlike the McKinley tariff, which was more of a partisan thing, Smoot-Hawley got pushback from a lot of different people, experts, business leaders, you name it.
Exactly. It wasn't just one side of the aisle saying, whoa, hold on. It was a chorus of voices saying this was a bad idea.
I remember reading that over 1,000 economists signed a petition urging President Hoover to veto the bill. That's pretty remarkable, that level of agreement among experts.
They were waving red flags, warning that this would stifle international trade and make the global economy, which was already teetering on the brink, even worse.
And it wasn't just academics. You had big-name business leaders, people like Henry Ford, speaking out against it too. Even within Hoover's own Republican Party, there was a lot of dissent.
Absolutely. And the concerns weren't just coming from within the U.S. either. Foreign trading partners were up in arms, threatening to retaliate if the U.S. went through with it. Even Hoover himself had serious doubts.
I think he even called it vicious, extortionate, and obnoxious at one point. But despite all those warnings, despite his own misgivings, he ended up signing it into law.
Yeah, he did. And the economic fallout was swift and brutal.
Those threats of retaliation, they weren't empty threats. More than 25 countries retaliated with their own tariffs on American goods.
It turned into an all-out global trade war, with everyone trying to protect their own economies by putting up barriers. And the result? Global trade basically went into free fall.
Yeah, free fall is the right word. Between 1929 and 1934, the value of international trade around the world plunged by roughly 65%. That's a two-thirds drop in global commerce.
That's huge. And the U.S. got hit especially hard. Imports from and exports to Europe, for example, both fell by about two-thirds in just a few years.
American farmers, they were really hurting. They lost their overseas markets, commodity prices collapsed, and a lot of them lost their farms. Rural banks were going under left and right. And then there's unemployment in the U.S., which reached a staggering 25% by 1932.
It was a perfect storm of economic disaster. Now, to be fair, Smoot-Hawley wasn't the only cause of that high unemployment figure. But did it make things worse? Absolutely.
No question about it. It was like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Exactly. And here's the irony. Smoot-hawley was meant to shield American industries, but it ended up raising prices on imported goods during a depression, the absolute worst time for that to happen.
People were already struggling to afford basic necessities.
Right, and it forced Americans to rely more on domestic goods. But then those retaliatory tariffs from other countries choked off demand for American products, which hurt export industries and led to even more job losses. It was a vicious cycle.
A downward spiral.
Yeah.
And the financial markets reacted accordingly. After showing some signs of recovery after the initial crash of '29, the stock market went back into a slump once Smoot-Hawley became law. Public opinion also soured on protectionism as the Depression dragged on. Smoot-Hawley became this symbol of failed economic isolationism.
It was a stark reminder that trying to go it alone in a globalized world could have disastrous consequences. And while no serious economist would say Smoot-Hawley single-handedly caused the Great Depression, most agree that it made a bad situation much, much worse. It fueled deflation, drove up unemployment, and some historians even argue that it indirectly contributed to political instability and extremism in other parts of the world by exacerbating those terrible economic conditions.
And just like with the McKinley tariff, there were political consequences. The Republican Party took a beating in the 1930 midterm elections, and then President Hoover lost to Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1932 presidential election.
Big time. Even Senator Smoot and Representative Hawley, the guys who the tariff was named after, they got voted out of office too. It's pretty clear the public wasn't happy with how things had played out.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And the Roosevelt administration, they basically did a complete 180 on trade policy. They passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, which gave the president the power to negotiate lower tariffs with other countries.
It was a huge shift in thinking. Instead of trying to wall ourselves off, the U.S. started working with other countries to lower trade barriers.
It was the beginning of a move towards more international cooperation on trade, which eventually led to things like the GATT and the World Trade Organization, or WTO. It really highlights how disastrous Smoot-Hawley was. Even the U.S. Senate's website calls it among the most catastrophic acts in congressional history.
It's become the go-to example of how badly trade wars can go wrong, a cautionary tale that's still relevant today. So when we look at both McKinley and Smoot-Hawley tariffs, the main takeaway is pretty clear. Protectionist policies, even though they're meant to help domestic industries, they can backfire spectacularly.
They can lead to higher prices for consumers, trigger retaliation from other countries, and cause a collapse in exports, all of which can contribute to serious economic downturns.
It's a recipe for disaster. And while it's important to remember that those tariffs weren't the only things that caused the depressions of the 1890s and 1930s, there were other factors at play. They definitely made those bad situations a whole lot worse.
Like throwing a match on a pile of dry leaves.
Exactly. And the public's reaction in both cases shows that voters do pay attention when economic policies go off the rails, and they're willing to hold their elected officials accountable.
They sure are. And these historical episodes also highlight how interconnected the global economy really is. When a big player like the U.S. raises tariffs on its own, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Other countries react, and everybody ends up getting hurt, including the country that started the whole thing.
It's like a chain reaction. One thing leads to another, and pretty soon everyone's worse off. These tariffs are great examples of how actions have consequences, unintended consequences. For anyone interested in financial history, these two tariffs are like case studies in how economic decisions can have these huge ripple effects that nobody saw coming. Like, you try to protect jobs with a tariff, but then it sparks a trade war and you end up with more job losses because your export markets dry up.
It's a reminder that things are rarely as simple as they seem.
Right. And while economists might still debate the exact role these tariffs played in those depressions, there's a general consensus that they made already bad situations much worse. And that's why people bring up those two historical examples all the time whenever there's talk about new tariffs or the possibility of trade wars. They're cautionary tales reminding us that even when protectionism is well-intentioned, it can lead to the very problems it's supposed to solve.
Like economic instability, global trade grinding to a halt, and more economic hardship for everyone.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the McKinley and Smoot-Hawley tariffs, it leaves you, dear listener, with a question to ponder.
Given what we've learned from history, what could be the long-term consequences of today's trade policies and all the talk about tariffs, especially in a world that's more interconnected than ever?
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. It forces us to think about how to strike that balance between looking out for our own interests and being part of a global economic system.
It's a balancing act, for sure. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.